As the morning sun illuminated New York's skyscrapers, Carol Watson was already at her desk. She had built a career of over 10 years at a major accounting firm, and her colleagues admired her diligence and meticulousness this morning. 2. She had arrived earlier than anyone else and was reviewing a client's financial statements. After glancing briefly at the skyline visible from the office window, Carol opened her planner to check this month's schedule. Circled in red pen was the date for her monthly remittance to her parents, a ritual she had maintained for 5 years. This habit began when her father, David, suffered a heart attack, and it had become part of her life. If Dad can't work anymore, and Mom needs care, Carol had thought at the time, and continued sending a sum larger than her own apartment rent to her parents every month. Fortunately, her father recovered, but Carol kept sending the money. Supporting her family was simply natural to her during her lunch break while eating a salad at a nearby cafe. Carol browsed through family photos on her smartphone. The screen displayed her sister Heather's radiant smile. Heather had a flashy, sociable personality, the complete opposite of Carol, looking at pictures of her sister, always the center of attention at parties. Carol couldn't help feeling plain in comparison. Looks like she's uploaded new photos to Instagram, Carol murmured, checking Heather's latest posts. There were dozens of pictures showing dinner with friends at an extravagant restaurant. Though Carol sighed softly, she was relieved to see her sister doing well. Her parents, especially her mother Martha, had always been captivated by Heather. "Your sister needs more attention because you've always been so responsible and never caused any worry." Carol had heard her mother say countless times her father David was also somewhat indulgent with Heather, trying his best to fulfill her capricious demands. Carol checked her bank book and reflected on her repeatedly postponed dream of buying a small Manhattan apartment. Just a little more patience. She told herself she had become passive about dating lately and didn't even attend the matchmaking parties her colleagues invited her to, dedicating her time and money to work. And family was now her way of life in the evening. As Carol was preparing to leave the office after a meeting, her smartphone rang. It was her parents. "Carol, wonderful news." Her mother, Martha's voice was elevated with excitement. "Heather's engaged. His name is Jason Clark, and he's a lawyer. He's a wonderful man, and we've met him. The wedding is in 3 months. My goodness, that's wonderful." Carol replied genuinely, "Happy? Please pass my congratulations to Heather. Of course, I'll attend the ceremony. Is there anything I can help with?" "Thank you, Carol." "Well, there's a lot of preparation to do. Could you come home next weekend? We'd like to discuss some things together." "Sure, Mom, I'll arrive Friday evening after hanging up." Carol took an old photograph of Heather from her desk drawer. It showed them as children holding hands on a beach. "My little sister is getting married," she whispered silently, praying for her sister's happiness. Then she began considering what gift to give for the wedding. Friday evening, Carol stepped out of a taxi and stood before her family home. Beautiful, well-tended flowers bloomed in the small garden, and the warm glow of the entrance light welcomed her. Her heart raced with nostalgia and the excitement of discussing her sister's wedding plans. When she knocked on the door, her mother, Martha, immediately rushed out. "Carol, you're here!" she exclaimed, opening her arms and embracing her daughter behind Martha. Her father, David, appeared and quietly patted his daughter's shoulder. "You look well," Carol said with relief. Her father's complexion showed no trace of his previous illness. He looked the picture of health. "Oh yes, I am not nearly as bad as you worried about." David laughed cheerfully. "Come in, Heather's here too, in the living room." Heather was sitting on the sofa, looking at her smartphone. She flipped her flashy blonde hair and gave Carol what seemed like a somewhat patronizing smile. "Hi sis, you made it everything? Okay." With work, Heather's voice had a superficial kindness, but her eyes suggested she was thinking about something else. "Yes, I adjusted my schedule," Carol answered calmly, placing her suitcase in the hallway. "So how are the wedding preparations coming along? Tell me more about Jason." Heather immediately began enthusiastically talking about her fiancé, detailing everything from their meeting to his proposal. Her words were peppered with phrases like wonderful family home in an upscale neighborhood and a partner track. Carol smiled as she listened, but couldn't help wondering, are those the kind of criteria important when choosing a spouse? After dinner, the four gathered in the living room and began discussing wedding details over coffee. "It sounds like it's going to be a lovely wedding," Carol said. "Is there anything I can help with?" After a moment of silence, Martha hesitantly said, "Actually, Carol, your help has already been a huge support." "What do you mean?" Carol tilted her head. Martha and David exchanged glances, seeming to confirm something with each other. David cleared his throat slowly and began speaking. "You see, Carol, the money you've been sending us every month," he seemed to be choosing his words carefully, "we've been putting it toward Heather's wedding expenses." Carol doubted her ears for a moment. "What?" "But that money I was sending it for Dad's medical expenses and your living costs." Martha quickly interjected, "Yes, that's how it started, but David's health improved, and we weren't really struggling that much. So you've been saving the money?" Carol was becoming confused. "That's right." Martha smiled somewhat uncomfortably. "In the end, we decided to use it for Heather's wedding. With the money you've sent over 5 years, we can have the most magnificent wedding." Carol just sat there, stunned in her mind. She recalled all the days she had economized, the overtime hours she had worked, and the dreams she had given up. "But why didn't you tell me I wanted to use that money to buy my own apartment?" Carol's voice was calm, but her eyes revealed her hurt. Martha showed some irritation. "Carol, we're family, so of course we'd use it for your sister. Heather deserves a beautiful wedding. It's the most important day of her life." Carol slowly looked at Heather, far from showing any guilt. Her sister looked somewhat satisfied. "Sorry," Heather said, but her voice held no genuine apology. "But it's a once-in-a-lifetime special day for me." Then she suddenly giggled. "But sis, since you're so plain, don't come to the ceremony, just be our sponsor." Those words stabbed Carol's heart, far from reprimanding their daughter for this cruel joke. Her parents seemed to agree, and her father just shrugged slightly. "Oh, Heather," Martha's tone was mildly scolding, but her eyes were laughing. "But Carol, you understand, don't you? Heather's friends are all glamorous and social. You might be a bit out of place." Carol felt the blood drain from her face. For 5 years. She had put her own life second to help her family. And yet this was all she received in return. She was no longer wanted. Only her money was needed. After a long silence, Carol suppressed her emotions and quietly said, "I understand I'm a bit tired, so I'll go to bed now." As she left the room, Carol turned and smiled. The smile may have looked perfect, but her eyes seemed devoid of any feeling as she climbed the stairs. A plan was taking shape in Carol's mind. "I've decided to prepare the perfect gift for my sister's wedding day," she vowed silently. What that a gift would be, no one yet knew. When she entered her room and closed the door, Carol cried for the first time, but these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of determination. When the morning sun shone through the window, illuminating Carol's cheek, she was already awake, though she had barely slept. Her eyes were calm and filled with resolve. She packed only necessities in a small travel bag and took a deep breath as she sat on the bed. Good morning Heather's voice could be heard downstairs. She seemed to be chatting happily with her mother. Carol quietly left her room and descended the stairs at the breakfast table. Her father sat reading the newspaper. "Good morning." Her father looked up from his newspaper and said, "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, perfectly." Carol smiled gently. "I need to return to New York today. Some urgent work came up." What Martha turned around with a surprised expression, "But we were planning to discuss the wedding details." Carol took a sip of coffee and said in a calm voice, "Don't worry, we can stay in touch by phone and email. I want to help with the preparations." Heather looked at Carol somewhat suspiciously, but quickly became absorbed and talked about her own wedding. "We've decided on Eternal Moment near Central Park for the venue. I was shocked by how luxurious it is, but thanks to your money, sis, we can have it at such a dreamy place." Carol just smiled. Wonderful Eternal Moment. "I'll remember that." After breakfast, Carol called a taxi and said goodbye to her family. "I'll be in touch," she said. Giving Heather a light hug, Heather showed almost no interest and had already returned to her smartphone in the taxi. Carol took out her smartphone and searched for the contact information for Eternal Moment. 2 weeks after returning to New York, Carol entered the building through the back entrance of Eternal Moment. She was greeted by Eric Johnson, the venue's senior manager, who welcomed her in her business suit. "Ms. Watson, it's an honor to meet you." Eric greeted her politely after hearing your story. "We want to cooperate as much as possible." Carol nodded slightly. I appreciate your understanding of my situation." They entered a small office at the back of the venue. Documents were spread on the table, and a presentation was displayed on the monitor. "As per your request, we're prepared to play the video message during the main ceremony." Eric explained the host will introduce it as a surprise for the bride and groom. At this timing, Carol took out a USB drive and placed it on the table. "This is the video I've prepared. Could you test it?" Eric inserted the USB into the computer and played the video for the first few minutes. Carol's congratulatory message flowed along with reminiscences about her sister. However, when the screen switched, it displayed formal bank statements and transfer records. "These are the records of the remittances I've been sending to my parents for 5 years, $3,000 every month, totaling over $180,000. Carol's narration continued the screen, then switched to a conversation Carol had secretly recorded with her parents, acknowledging they had been saving that money, and this is how that money was used. Next displayed were photos of Heather's lavish parties collected from her social media accounts, posts showing off luxury brand items, and intimate photos with men other than her fiancé Jason. Additionally, evidence documents of Heather's significant credit card debt were shown. "Jason, you seem like a good person, so you have the right to know the truth. My sister has been leading a double life with at least 3 men over the past 5 years, and currently she has over $120,000 in debt." At the end of the video, Carol's serene face appeared, and she said, "This is my finest gift. The truth." When the video ended, Eric looked at Carol with a slightly strained expression. "This is quite shocking." "Content truth can be shocking," Carol replied. "Matter-of-factly, my family has been using me for 5 years. I loved them, but to them I was just an ATM." After thinking for a moment, Eric asked worriedly, "Are there any legal concerns?" All evidence was collected legally. The recordings were made in states where one-party consent is legal. Social media posts are public information, Carol answered methodically. "I'm an accountant. I've carefully calculated the legal risks." As the wedding day approached, Carol continued with her normal work routine and responded to calls and messages from her family as usual, even to Heather's semi-commanding message, "Actually, don't come to the ceremony." "Okay?" She simply replied, "I understand it's your special day. You should be the star." The night before the wedding, Carol was on her apartment balcony drinking wine and looking up at the stars when her friend Lisa called. "Are you sure about this?" Lisa asked worriedly. She was one of the few people who knew about Carol's plan. "Yes," Carol answered quietly. "For 5 years, I sacrificed my own life to support them, and yet what they did to me." Her voice trembled slightly. "Tomorrow, it will all be over the wedding day." Eternal Moment was decorated more beautifully than Carol had ever seen from a monitor. Backstage, she watched the invited guests gather in the hall. Her parents sat in the front row, looking proud. Jason's family also added elegance to the venue with their refined appearance that exuded wealth and status. "It's about to begin?" Eric said to Carol. "Will you watch from here?" Carol nodded. "Yes, this is fine." The ceremony began, and the groom. Jason stood nervously at the altar. The wedding march played, and Heather entered, escorted by her father David. Her dress was extravagant, making it immediately obvious how much of Carol's money had been spent on it after the vows were exchanged and rings placed. The host stepped forward. "And now we have a surprise for the bride and groom," the host said with a smile. A special video message from the bride's sister, Carol Watson. The screen in the hall descended and the lights dimmed for the first few minutes. As Carol's warm, congratulatory message played, Heather smiled, though somewhat puzzled, however. When the screen changed and bank statements began to appear, Heather's expression froze. And as the true nature of her and her parents was revealed one after another, the venue fell silent when photos of Heather with her lovers were shown. The groom Jason changed color and stood up when evidence of Heather's debts was presented. His father also rose, watching the screen with a stern expression when the video concluded with Carol's words, "This is my finest gift." The truth, the venue was already in an uproar. Carol quietly watched the confusion in the hall through the monitor. There were no tears on her face, just an expression of relief as if something had ended. "Ready?" Eric asked softly. "Yes," Carol answered in a composed voice. "Let's proceed to the next step as planned." The venue had fallen into complete chaos. Guests were looking at each other whispering, and some had started taking videos with their phones. Heather stood in front of the altar, her face pale. "This is nonsense," she shouted in a trembling voice. "My sister is lying, she's just jealous." The groom. Jason stood motionless, simply stunned. His eyes were dark with betrayal and anger. "Is this true, Heather?" His voice was quiet, but his words echoed throughout the venue. "No, Jason." Heather desperately grabbed his arm. "Those photos are old. They're from before we met." Jason's father stepped forward and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Son, we should leave," he said in a stern voice. "There's no need to continue this farce." At this moment, Carol quietly entered through the rear door of the venue. She walked confidently in a simple navy blue dress. All eyes in the venue turned to her at once. Her parents, David and Martha, stared at their daughter accusingly from the front row. "Carol, what have you done?" Martha cried out in a trembling voice. Carol walked calmly down the central aisle and stopped in front of the altar. "I only told the truth." "Mom," she said. "But why?" David choked on his words. "We are family." "Yes, we are family," Carol answered calmly. "And that's precisely why we should have cherished and respected each other. Don't you think?" She gazed at Heather and then turned to the groom. Jason, I'm sorry, perhaps you shouldn't have learned the truth this way, but I thought you had the right to know everything before starting a new life." Jason stared at Carol for a long time, then quietly nodded. "Thank you," he managed to say. Carol took an envelope with documents from her bag. "Actually, I had prepared a different gift." She pointed at the screen on the stage. Eric received the signal, and a new image was displayed. It showed a bank account statement with a balance of $500,000 for 5 years. I had also been saving for my sister's future. I had prepared this money as a down payment for Heather and Jason's new home. Gasps of surprise rose from the audience. Heather was speechless, and her parents were stunned. But that money has now been donated to a charity called Redditstories. Carol continued, "This organization supports people who have been hurt by family betrayal." The screen displayed a donation certificate confirming that $500,000 had indeed been donated in Carol Watson's name. "Family is built on trust," Carol said quietly. "You betrayed that trust. I will never be deceived again." The groom's father stepped forward and said to Carol, "Miss Watson, I respect your courage. Thank you for revealing the truth to protect our family's honor." He looked sternly at Heather and her parents. "The Clark family does not associate with such dishonest people." "Dad!" Jason raised his voice. "Son, it's decided," his father said with a resolute voice. "This engagement is over right now." Jason took a deep breath and gazed at Heather. "I loved you, Heather." His voice was filled with sadness. "But there's no future in a marriage built on lies." He removed the engagement ring from his finger and placed it on the altar. "Goodbye," Heather collapsed in tears, crumpling to the floor. Martha and David rushed to their daughter's side, but unable to bear the cold stares around them, the three quickly retreated to the side of the venue. Carol stood quietly. What she had planned was completed, but there was no joy of victory. There was only a somewhat empty relief, as if freed from a long, carried burden. Eric came to her side. "Miss Watson, what will you do now?" "I'm leaving," Carol answered quietly. "It's over," before leaving the venue. Carol approached the groom's father. "Mr. Clark, I'm sorry for the disturbance." "No, you were brave." Mr. Clark took her hand. "I can hardly believe someone as sincere as you came from such a family." Carol smiled slightly. "Thank you. But I too turned a blind eye to the truth for a long time, because they were family when she left the venue." Carol didn't look back. The bright sunshine outside greeted her, suggesting a new beginning. A taxi was waiting, and as she opened the door, a voice called from behind, "Carol!" Turning around, she saw Jason hurrying toward her. "Can we talk?" he asked with a serious expression. Carol was a bit surprised, but nodded calmly. "Of course. Why did you go so far?" Jason asked quietly. "That $500,000, did you really save it for your sister?" "Yes," Carol answered honestly. "I loved my family, but they only exploited my affection." "I understand," Jason nodded deeply. "Your sister was very captivating, but I'm glad I got to know the real her before the marriage." Carol lightly touched his arm, showing empathy. "I hope you can make a fresh start, you two." Jason smiled slightly. They exchanged goodbyes, and Carol got into the taxi to the airport. "Please," she told the driver. As the taxi drove away, Carol gazed out the window complex. Emotions swirled in her heart, but strangely, her heart felt light now. Free from the burden of 5 years, she was ready to reclaim her own life. 1 year later in New York, Carol was admiring the view of Manhattan's skyscrapers glinting in the morning sun from the balcony of her apartment with a warm coffee in hand. She took a deep breath. 6 months had passed since she purchased this condominium, and she felt a quiet joy in finally having a place she could call her own Carol. "Are you ready?" Lisa's voice came from inside. She was Carol's best friend, and their bond had deepened since that wedding day. "Yes, just a moment." Carol answered, finishing the last sip from her coffee cup back in the apartment. Lisa was reviewing documents in the living room. "This charity program application is well written," she said with a smile. "You're doing something truly wonderful." Carol nodded slightly. "Thank you," she answered gently. "Since I started participating in a fresh start activities, my life has truly changed a few months after the wedding." Carol had begun volunteering with the charity she had donated to, and now she was thriving as the program director for an initiative supporting people betrayed by family. Her accounting skills and personal experience were helping people facing similar situations. "I hope the new support group launch gets approved at today's meeting," Lisa said as she put the documents in her bag. "It will work out," Carol answered confidently. Her expression showed no trace of past wounds, only strength and peace on the way to the office. Carol checked messages on her cell phone. There were contacts from colleagues and grateful messages from members of the support program. She now had true friends around her. "Have you heard anything about Heather and your parents?" Lisa quietly asked in the taxi. Carol answered while gazing out the window a little. "I heard from a mutual acquaintance. Heather is being pursued by debt collectors. My parents have lost credibility in the community and are struggling quite a bit." "Do you regret it?" Lisa asked hesitantly. Carol thought for a moment before answering. "I don't regret it, but there is sadness. No one would have wanted family relationships to end that way." When they arrived at the office, Carol was warmly welcomed by program members under her guidance. Many people were reclaiming their lives after the meeting ended. Carol returned to her desk and was organizing the day's documents. "Ms. Watson, this arrived for you." The receptionist brought a letter, looking at the envelope. She saw it was from her father, David. Carol stared at the letter in surprise. There had been no contact from her family for the past year, quietly closing her office door. Carol opened the letter. "Dear Carol," her father's handwritten message began. "It has taken me months to write this letter. I didn't know where to begin." The letter detailed her father's remorse, how they had taken Carol for granted and exploited her love and generosity, how difficult their lives had become since Heather's wedding, and above all, his deep regret for what they had done to Carol only after losing you. Did we understand how foolish we had been? I know we don't deserve to ask for forgiveness. I just hope you are well and happy someday. If you wish, I hope you might give us a chance to see you again." Carol finished reading the letter and gazed out the window. Complex emotions swirled in her heart. There was no longer hatred or anger, just a quiet understanding and the possibility of healing that comes with time. "It will take time," she whispered softly. "But someday, when they show true remorse and make amends." Carol carefully placed the letter in her desk drawer and stood up. The view of the city from her window was beginning to be tinted by the sunset. A small smile formed on her lips, having reclaimed her life and found a new purpose. She was now truly free,